This is Sirens, a Bombshell production. I'm Loren DeJonge Schulman.
I'm Radha Plumb.
And I'm Erin Simpson. Bombshell was a fantastic podcast, if we don't mind us saying so. It was both of its era and had elements that stood the test of time. As we think about podcasting and the way we dialogue, it has evolved in different ways to blend content, both video and subscriber episodes, and all kinds of other innovations. And over the last few years, as we mentioned on our reunion episode, our interests and professional activities have expanded and changed along with our expertise. So today, there's lots of opportunities for analyzing the here and now and what's hot in Washington, but not much opportunity to dive deep.
So we are relaunching, but with a twist. We're calling this new edition Sirens, and our goal is to dissect the institutions underpin American power, which sounds super nerdy, but we know you love it. We're going to cover a lot of issues from our old era, but include technology and governance as well as national security issues to unpack what is just a fire drill you don't need to pay as much attention and what you should be running for a shelter for.
So with maybe a little less White House mayhem, but still the wit and charm you've come to expect, we're going to start on this podcast. It is a work in progress, so we'll ask you to join us on this odyssey as we figure out what works and what is likely to lure men to their death.
We're going to focus a lot on the latter, just to be clear. So we've got everybody for that as rationally as they can. But one thing we're going to keep going with, but in a slightly different way, is keeping up our usual bombshell questions. But we've got to test out new ones to see what actually makes sense. So I'm going to start with the first one. And that is, what is your most irrational intellectual pet peeve? Radha, what about you?
It is when people use the word equilibrium to mean like it is a good or desired point instead of just it is a natural settling point, because equilibrium is a value neutral term in economics. And in general, in the like set of science terms it comes from, it does not imply that that is good or desirable. And in fact, often there can be multiple equilibria and those states have different preferences. So yes, anyway, all of that is to say equilibrium, use it right.
God, okay, that reminds me. I had a former boss that would correct people in meetings. You say, like, no, you don't have momentum. You have inertia because you're just going at the same pace. And that's okay. Inertia is fine. And we'd all be like, how do I have to, I can't keep listening to this lecture over and over again. Erin, what about you?
Radha kind of bounced off mine. I wouldn't call it an intellectual pet peeve, but somehow I got focused in my brain about Latin plurals when I was younger. And so there are not equilibriums, there are equilibria. There are not referendums, there are referenda. And worse, there are not stadiums, there are stadia. No one else does this. This is not how people talk. This is not even like AP style for writing. It just ended up being something that sticks in my craw. So if you see me twitch when you say equilibriums, it's not because I'm an economist. It's because I'm a pedant.
Do you say datum? I don't even know how to say that as opposed to data.
But I do say the data are. I do believe in the plural data.
Love it. Okay, well, mine, and this is a long-standing one, I think I've probably said it on the show before, is the people who mix up allies versus partners. Like when somebody says, like, Saudi Arabia is a close ally. Like, they are not. We do not have a mutual defense agreement with them. They are not an ally. Stop confusing everyone. That drives me nuts.
That's a good one. Yes, that's important. But it also leads to a lot of clunky speech writing where we talk about allies and partners, and partners.
Yes, yeah. And how many times is it in the National Defense Strategy? Who knows?
Who knows?
All right. Next one, slightly more ridiculous, literally. What is the most ridiculous thing you have ever found at the bottom of your work bag? Erin?
I mean, I just feel like everything in my work bag is ridiculous. And it's probably like some juxtaposition of a lipstick that I bought 5 years ago and have since bought 5 nearly, but not quite identical colors to match while I was trying to find that one. Plus, like, ear protection from some random flight that I, had sat on once upon a time, and it still just like lives in this bag. But the best things in the bags are when work bags are like putting on winter coats and you find something that like you haven't seen in a while. And you're like, oh, that's from this job. I'd forgotten all about that.
Yeah, like $20. I do that all the time where it's like suddenly I found cash in my pocket. This is great. Radha, what about you?
Maybe it's those, those free headphones you get on the airplane when
Yeah.
you want to listen and you need something to plug in, and of course you only have earbuds. Except that I find approximately an increasingly giant ball of like dozens of them, because every time I'm like, oh, I'll just save this for later. That way I don't have to take another one out the next time I'm on an airline. Except then when I'm on an airline, I entirely forget about it. And then I put it in my bag to save it for later and rinse and repeat. And then periodically when I'm trying to find something in my bag, I reach down and I find, 37 free and not very effective
How are
airline
you
headphones.
flying without noise canceling headphones? What are you doing?
I have earbuds. They have Bluetooth.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't connect to the screen always.
Yeah.
On some planes they do, but often on domestic flights they don't.
Yeah. For me, so when I go to a new coffee shop, one that I've not been to before, I'm a guilt buyer. So I'll buy coffee, but I always am guilted into buying something else. I don't know why. I don't have a relationship with those people yet. So it's almost always a croissant or something like that. So you end up with piles of tiny bags of croissants at the bottom of my work bag. What will occasionally happen is like the croissant crumbs will sort of explode out in a blizzard of croissant crumbs. And they're just not really recovering from that. So anyway, I'm disgusting. My work bag is gross, as you both know well. All right.
Are there TikTok videos of cleaning out work bags the same way there are videos of washing cars and rug cleaning, which are very satisfying?
Yeah, they probably should be. I should steam clean my work bag. Whatever the nuclear equivalent of my work bag, it should be done.
So for our next segment, which we are still working through many different names for, but this is kind of our top three, our what's on your mind, what's stuck in your craw from the last few weeks. And I guess I'll go first. I've been focusing on the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which is big, but not necessarily all that beautiful. It's kind of in the news this week for a variety of things. For folks who maybe haven't been tracking, it is a very large, essentially tax policy bill, but which also includes a number of significant budget cuts to things like Medicaid and SNAP. It has a few other tax breaks and tax cuts, including removing taxes on tips and overtime. And also has a big defense plus up of over 150 billion for a whole range of things, which I think we talked a little bit about last time on the reunion show. What's interesting this week is a couple of things. One, the increasingly imperiled in the Senate. The House passed a version of this at some point in the last couple of weeks, but it's now sitting with the Senate. And two, there's new scoring from the Congressional Budget Office, which says that they would increase the deficit by over 2.4 trillion over the next decade. And that has sent weird little flutters, not just through the stock market, which I sort of understand, but through the bond market, which I definitely don't understand. But I know it's bad if people are talking about the bond market. Like there are bad things for sort of the American economy writ large. So I've been very interested to see both what the nature of the cuts are that actually end up in the so-called bill, but also kind of how the broader set of markets reacts to what's essentially a huge set of tax cuts, continuing the Trump 2017 tax cuts with no offsets in revenue, and then some, spending cuts that are not necessarily that meaningful in the grand scope of the budget, but are incredibly impactful to individual families and local economies. That's what's on my mind.
And just before I talk about what's on my mind, I think the bond market piece is more important than a lot of times we realize. I mean, long story short, there's just a bunch of really inflationary things that are happening at the same time. Tariffs are inflationary. They increase prices. The tax cuts are inflationary. They put money back. So there's just a whole bunch of things that are pushing prices up, and at the same time contracting the availability of goods, because that's what tariffs do, and that's what potentially recessions do. So it certainly makes, and that's separate from the sort of political economy of the dollar and the dollar economy that we've already talked about. So like those pieces all together do mean sort of US bonds and their status as being really predictable and safe investment vehicles gets a lot more questionable over time, which is terrible as a way for the US to deal with financing its debt, which links back to the debt generated by the tax cuts. So anyway, thank you for listening to my nerdy aside. The thing that's stuck in my craw, or the thing I think that I'm looking at a lot, is this ongoing set of immigration issues separate from the ICE raids and deportations, which of course are complex and producing a lot of protests currently. There is a host of immigration policies that are actually also choking off just who can come into the country, including international students for universities and the sort of newest version of the travel ban that folks will recall from the first Trump administration. This one is structured in a more, I guess, legally defensible way, potentially. But it means that, there's a whole host of people that the US has either made commitments to, like, for instance, former Afghan partners, to not trip Lauren's trigger, but folks who worked with the U.S. And also just individuals who, are seeking to leave a host of different countries and come to the U.S., but also, and kind of really critically, students who are going to a range of universities. There was a specific targeting at Harvard, but more broadly, decline in kind of bringing talent into the U.S. is really problematic broadly, but particularly in kind of the emerging technology fields where a lot of great talent comes to the US internationally. And that both is sort of productivity and business enhancing, but also really a feature of what drives a lot of the American innovation. And so cutting that out feels particularly dangerous, especially right now.
On that last piece, I think as a long-term challenge, not just as the immediate risk that you're seeing to international students. Think about if you are not career counselor, if you're a college counselor at a school in the UK or India or China or elsewhere, and this year your students have a hard time getting into the United States universities for whatever reason, they've got blockers. And then maybe also next year, highly unlikely that you're going to continue to want to recommend colleges in the United States. So even if, for whatever reason, the Trump administration changed their mind and said, like, no, actually, that was dumb. We're good. We're resetting here. They're going to struggle enormously with getting able to recruit that back. So, like, the long-term implications here, in addition to just the immediate and, like, the very stressful impact on students and their families, is huge. I have to say, like, the thing that's been on my mind, I'm trying to get rid of it because it's sort of driving me nuts, and I hate the fact that I'm obsessing over it, is the impact of the chaos that is the Pentagon Foreign Office and the National Security Council reorganization. I think we have now seen 2 reorganizations in the NSC-ish since the beginning of the administration. And then the Pentagon Foreign Office, like, I don't even know how to describe what iteration we're on. And what's crazy to me about this is, coming back to, like, the long-term themes, like, these are usually places where top talent of any kind is hoping to go. And that also a whole lot of the U.S. national security apparatus relies on as a center of competence in some way. Even if they disagree with it, they rely on it, like, all right, you're going to take care of stuff for us. You're going to manage the crises. You're going to organize the conversation. You're going to translate the orders from the president to others. Both the Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Defense's Foreign Office, as well as SC staff, have not the same, but a similar role in terms of taking really challenging, complex sets of issues, presenting them up for quick decisions, and then translating those back down for complicated implementation plans that are throughout the national security apparatus. And if both of those struggling, failing, resetting at all points in time, it's just going to be an interesting moment over the next several weeks of national security. It's also, I love that we're finally getting the natural experiment in what happens if the NSC is significantly smaller. I find that to be the weakest intellectual critique of the SC possible. Is like, if only it were smaller, it would be better. Like, sure, I'm sure that works out exactly in your head. Like, the typical line is that National Security Council staffs are exactly what the presidents want them to be. Whether they are 500 people or 75 people, it is the incompetence that you see or the chaos that you see is because they like it that way. So Marco Rubio is getting his chance to figure this out, having 75 people on staff, moving functions to DoD and state. I wish him the very best of luck in figuring out how you actually run that. And I mean that genuinely. I think this is going to be interesting to see if you could actually shift them to more of a longer term thinking apparatus, but it's also, to me, just as likely that they become kind of creepy political commissars that are operating on behalf of the president. But that, in addition to the total gossip girl set of nonsense coming out of the Secretary's Foreign Office, of the backbiting and the eavesdropping and the who's dating who and all of that, like, I'm sure it's very bad for the country, but it's delicious to watch day to day.
I have to say, in researching for this episode, I came across an article talking about Senator Elizabeth Warren sending a letter to Marco Rubio to ask about SpaceX's contracts. And I was like, why is Senator Warren sending a letter to the Secretary of State? She was sending a letter to Marco Rubio as National Security Advisor, which I had already kind of memory hold. So yes, he will probably need a bit of luck to make that work. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to revisit any one of these topics, possibly have side episode deep dives on subtopics. We aren't sure. We're still working on this, and we'll see which one of them maybe lures men to their death. Okay, next segment, a little bit more on the deep dives of things. And I think Radha is here to guide us on a discussion of one of her, I want to say favorite topics, but associated topics, aligned topics.
Sure. So I want to take a couple minutes to just talk about the DeepSeek, this is the Chinese company that launched its sort of generative AI model that is at least comparably performant to the set of models that are being run in the US. And so for those who aren't sort of watching the AI evolution in real time, a couple years back, ChatGPT sort of broke onto the scene as essentially this new form of AI that rather than doing sort of narrow work, it had much broader applicability to be able to scan a whole bunch of information that it was trained on and generate new content. We call it generative AI. And it started with text, though now it can do music and imagery and a whole host of other applications. And the companies that initially have really broken to the forefront are in the US. So that's places like OpenAI, Anthropic, Google through their DeepMind program, Facebook. And, there was a general view that the US was far ahead, but trying to really constrain that. In the Biden administration, there was an effort to constrain sort of development and growth in China in particular, based on concerns of sort of the growing competition with China in a host of political and military senses. So what DeepSeek really was China figuring out how to work around those market distortions, those export controls, and figure out how to make a performant model. Now, there's a big debate in the AI community on whether it is a big deal, whether it really is a workaround, whether it relied on the US basically solving the problem through a range of open source information that's available. In particular, my view on this is really the debate comes down to two big things. One is sort of what are we actually competing on / racing on? And I have a piece in Foreign Affairs from a couple of weeks back that talks about this, which is a lot of people focus on these models in terms of which one is the very best. And they have these benchmarks like, can it solve really complicated science problems? Can it do certain kinds of games or puzzles? But it turns out a lot of the performance gains and productivity gains you can get from these models don't need to have you to be the first to cross a certain threshold or benchmark. A lot of the performant models can be 75 to 80% as good as the very best model available and still produce a lot of gain. And so thinking about how we're actually scaling and using these new generative AI capabilities rather than only focusing on those benchmarks is really important. But I think the other piece and question that it raises is sort of how much is and where is AI in this big competition with China, right? And what does it mean for China to be able to, through companies that are able to leverage state-sponsored funding to be able to use certain kinds of data that is restricted in the US, but even more so in Europe. What does it mean for competition, both in a social and like political and military sense? Everything from, hey, if these models scale and it has restricted information like Tiananmen Square, what does that do for kind of information and understanding and history? But also, what does it mean for the ability of companies to really catch up quickly, especially with government funding? And does that create advantages in different ways? And so I think that's really where the debate stands right now.
I can jump in and ask a question, and apologies if this is more politics than technology, but in this sense, does it make sense to even think about who has, quote, the best model or the most powerful model? Or is it actually something where there's a commoditized version of useful AI technologies that any number of actors, state, non-state, major powers, minor powers, can access?
I guess my view is it's probably a bit of both, right? So, if you have a model that can do something that no one else can do, that's going to confer either business advantage, national advantage, depending on how you're using it. But also, a lot of the performance improvements, at least where we are right now, kind of the AI journey of most countries is like you can get a lot of gain by just using it and incorporating it into some like ways you're doing business. And that doesn't really need the very best or most powerful model. That really just needs a good enough model and then figuring out actually how to use it.
Like the United States government for the past few years has spent a fair amount of intellectual power and time on how do we limit, hold back, constrain Chinese advancements in this space while also advancing our own to include various rulemakings that have been promulgated and other tactics and tools that they've used in order to limit their access to certain kinds of technologies and talent. And I think the announcements with that were clearly for a variety of reasons, but some of them probably also to show like, hey guys, that didn't work. And how should the folks who are looking at the AI diffusion rule and other things like that right now, how should they be thinking of that? Should they be thinking of that like, all right, so that works to a degree, but there's other things we need to think about too, and we are so not into that space yet? Or is there a natural new space for them to think of in terms of how to constrain Chinese growth in this area?
Yeah, I mean, look, my view is like all market distortion, the intent of the restrictions were always to create time, not to like permanently prevent it. So I think was probably the right way to frame it. I think that time it constrained was short, but I think the problem with market distortions in general is like incentives matter, and like people are going to want to build AI models because they have lots of uses and lots of returns. And scientists like to solve hard problems, and that's true for Chinese scientists, and it's true for American scientists, and it's true for Indian scientists. So and so it kind of fosters some innovation really on the Chinese side to create these constraints and challenges. But I think the bigger picture is like, yeah, it's like a full, right, you need the export controls to buy time, but you need the technology and investments in the government, and you also need the talent. And harkening back to the previous section, like if you're basically like, well, we're going to get rid of all the new STEM talent that's coming from all over the world and push them out of America to other markets, like that's probably not going to be super helpful. Between the student visas and the H-1B visas, like you're really kind of cutting off your nose to spite your face. And that's really contrary to the view that we need to have the very best talent in the world working on this at American companies to kind of continue to accelerate. And so, yeah.
So just to harken back to our beginning conversation, maybe we should like let them learn here or come visit their families here. Crazy ideas.
Right. Crazy.
Well, and I think a topic, both in the specific, whether that's, AI or specific, model competition, but also more broadly, I think that we are looking to explore, in this podcast series is much more about how some of these underlying things really translate into national power, right? And so how does funding for science and technology research, how does immigration policy, how does technological innovation and development all feed into things that establish kind of various aspects of America's role in the world, not just from a national security perspective, but also as a market leader, as a soft power leader, as a place for talent. And there's challenges that are going on lots of those levels, directly from the current administration, but also some challenges we've been experiencing over time as well. And so in some ways, we're kind of putting a very, very fine point on that in the near term. But there's some issues that we can explore as they've kind of gone over the long term. Next.
So this is actually a good transition, or a really messy one, depending on your views on the situation, into what is a very real, in real time, on social media argument about the nature of American power and who's in the Epstein files and who's running all of the technological centers of the United States industrial base or otherwise, between President Trump and Elon Musk, who are breaking up in front of all of us in real time. And it's both glorious and also so scary at the same time. It's really hard to say what kind of emotions to feel. But Erin, you want to kick us off in terms of like, what is this? What are we watching right now? Because it is both hilarious, but also a really big deal at the same time. So how should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, and there's a couple of ways I think we can think about this. So for folks who maybe don't live on social media or otherwise under a rock, last week, the feud, it was very much on like a low simmer as there was announced that Elon Musk was leaving his role at Doge and was no longer going to play quite such a prominent role in the administration. This sort of feud exploded on social media this week, this feud exploded on social media last week, seemingly prompted by Musk's dissing of the so-called and previously discussed Big Beautiful Bill and encouragement by senators or for senators to vote against it. That exchange actually then went back and forth between Trump posting on Truth Social and Musk posting on X, which of course he owns, and highlighted several aspects of kind of the intertwined relationship between these two men, including how much money Musk spent on the 2024 presidential campaign, over $250 million, and that his sense that Donald Trump was insufficiently grateful for that. And also then President Trump threatening to cancel several of the major contracts that are awarded to Musk companies, including SpaceX. So on the one hand, I think there's really two different ways we can think about this. One is a little bit of the relationship between Washington and Silicon Valley and the elements of both the defense economy, but also the innovation economy, but also a little bit more broadly, like Trump as an autocrat and Musk as an oligarch. And the differences between what they each thought they were buying, what they each thought they were getting, and whether there was at some level kind of inevitability to this breakup. So maybe we can start a little bit with the Silicon Valley elements of this. Loren or Radha, do one of you want to remind us a little bit of the history of where Silicon Valley gets its name and kind of what its relationship with DC maybe has been over the years?
Well, I'm happy to start, and then I think Lauren also has a good amount of context. But I think, just going back in time, Silicon Valley, and especially in the sort of early aughts, maybe even probably into the 90s, there was a lot of the tech innovation, sort of new tech in terms of internet startups, and those communities kind of grew up really largely independent of the DC ecosystem in a way that was much more separate than, say, we used to think about the finance and big banks in New York with DC. And this sort of came to a head over a period of time when, for instance, large companies like Google didn't want to necessarily work with the Department of Defense, and there was large employee protests, but also a general sense that Silicon Valley was super liberal and left-leaning and democratic or Democrat in the political party sense. And we saw that really even through the Obama presidency and Trump won. Over the period of time of sort of end of Biden administration and into the early Trump administration, it looks like there was a marked shift really in some of those views with some major tech folks. And there's a interview with Mark Andreessen on this, on the venture capital investment side, but also with sort of folks like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg really hewing to Trump in particular. I don't know if it's the Republicans per se or Trump specifically. I guess time will tell. But Elon Musk in particular investing a lot of money into Republican elections in that cycle, and really, I would say, leaning all the way into Citizens United and the role that super PACs can play in just spending large amounts of money on specific races, try to drive specific outcomes. And I think that was widely seen as kind of the genesis of some of the partnerships between Musk and Trump.
So that, yes, and there's a lot to contextualize in this that a lot of our listeners know, so I'm not lecturing history, but it's a really interesting, like Trump and Musk are actually a really interesting microcosm of a longstanding challenge or longstanding thing, in that the foundations of Silicon Valley going back into the 70s and 80s, not just reliant on, but highly intertwined and maybe not quite besties, but like extremely collaborative in long-term relationships between the defense industrial base and the broader US industrial policy and what was going on in Silicon Valley at that point in time. And that, like, I think there's some resentment in the DC spaces of how that sometimes gets memory hold. Both good resentment, bad resentment. I don't want to say necessarily either one or the other. But the longer term foundations that even as that intertwining became maybe less obvious, meant that there still continues to be a lot of things that underwrite the success of Silicon Valley coming from Washington that aren't as recognized, whether those be the sort of tax incentives that we see around buying Teslas or a lot of other things that make the broader success of the companies that have grown up there not only possible to start, but possible to scale in a way that they would not have existed otherwise. And so neither of these is to say is that either is better or either needs to be besties and recognize one another. But there's a complication in that intertwining that makes it hard to have sides because there's always a need for one side per se to the other. The other interesting aspect of this that I think that kind of bridges onto Radha's point around the political shift is the late Obama era, mid-Obama era courtship of Silicon Valley by Washington, which was largely out of the defense established, but not exclusively, with a lot of people realizing like, oh my gosh, they do cool things here. And also, if only we could sprinkle some innovation on top, that would just solve everything for us and it would be great. So there was a lot of what we called general officer, flag officer tourism, GoFo tourism out to companies like Google to say, you guys are amazing, please teach me your ways. And with that, I think appropriately so, leaders in Silicon Valley realized they could have a fair amount of power and influence if they wielded it appropriately. And they are still, I think, I mean, I don't want to, there's not a one Silicon Valley view, but don't want to by any stretch, but they are, I think, kind of still feeling their oats in terms of how they exercise that view. And there's been a lot of interesting things to watch in terms of their investments in ALEC, in their investments in political campaigns, how they interact with US elections overall, both as social media platforms and otherwise, and a whole lot of things that have created just friction, but necessity to communicate. That means that there's always going to be a tension and intertwining.
So I think there's this other element that we mentioned as well, which is not as geographically specific as Silicon Valley itself, but the relationship between essentially presidents with maybe less than fully democratic tendencies and the very rich billionaires who may or may not be in their orbit. And not to draw I'm not trying to draw a Trump-Putin parallel in the way that people kind of usually do, but the way that billionaires have thrived under Putin or not over time is one of the things that kind of has jumped out at me over the last few days as we sort of watch this fall from grace for Musk. And so I'm wondering if there are, from you guys' perspective, was this tension between Trump and Musk specifically inevitable? And, what are some of the ramifications that we should be thinking through now that there seems to be, I guess, taking on its face that this is not like performance art and also not like stock market manipulation purely, but is in fact a genuine rift of some kind. What are some of the ramifications?
So what is fascinating to me about this in terms of this question of inevitability is how both of them have a really large, not quite overlapping audience that they have a huge amount of influence over, in the sense that President Trump has a lot of folks who are loyal to not just the Republican Party per se, but to him as an individual and the influence he has. Like whatever his views, they are pro-Trump. And if they start you drilling down into asking questions like, are you mothers being deported? No, but I'm for Trump. Musk has control over communications platform that has, and with that has a huge number of people who are intensely fascinated by, loyal to, trying to enable and empower him. And those are not necessarily overlapping. They can be overlapping in some cases, but they're also somewhat reliant on one another. Like Musk gets a lot of his influence by the fact that he was able to spend a ton of money on an election where he could do that. That wouldn't necessarily have happened if Trump hadn't been the candidate. And then vice versa, like would Trump have without Musk? I don't know. Would he be as effective in government now without Musk? Definitely not. But so they are mutually interdependent right now in a way that I don't know if this breakup could be forever for them, or if it is, then they're going to have to figure out how to not just monetize off of it, but how to grow their bases in a way that is not necessarily going to happen naturally.
I also think there's a piece of this that's, I don't know, philosophical bent, I'll call it, that is this view that people who are rich and have been, I'll call it successful, though obviously some of that comes from family and personal wealth, but leaving those pieces aside, have sort of special slash better capabilities to do all the things. And I think this notion of that Trump both embodies that and believes that, and so allows influence by billionaires in a, again, I'll use euphemistically pragmatic, which is largely pay to play sort of way. Just a different, I guess, model for how this can be. And that means that, to Lauren's point, they are interdependent, but also he sees them as sort of movable and swappable, right? Like if he wants a different billionaire with a different expertise and he wants them in that isn't unique to the individual. It's this view that like successful people are just, really good at things, and he'll just find another billionaire to do whatever it is he needs done. And I think that view creates this weird perverse outcome where, billionaires are sort of discardable. But they have, in the reverse leverage, if you've got the other part of Trump, which is if you've got someone who's willing to use any available lever of power to punish or excise people he wants punished or excised and reward people he wants rewarded, that really creates a power imbalance in that relationship between the, billionaires who could support him if they want, and Trump, who is kind of wielding those levers of power right now.
And Erin, to your point on more specific on the implications, and this comes back to the uncomfortableness of the relationship between Washington and Silicon Valley in terms of how much they build off of one another, how much they rely on one another. In that so Musk is not just like a billionaire who just has a ton of money and also has a social media platform. He has businesses that are reliant on access funding or other opportunities that are either directly incentivized by the United States government or indirectly so, whether that be SpaceX, which we should talk about more, Starlink, Tesla, and the tax incentives, the contracts, and other things that, even in the absence of corruption, like that still existed, are things that Musk and the success, his not only actual success, but his profile success relies on. All the stories that are about him, like, oh, his stock is tanking, or there are these problems with these companies in some ways, like those have real impacts on him. In terms of his reputation, but also in terms of his business lines. But like I said, we're watching that play out in real time due to their disagreements about what's in the bill, the not big Build Back Better bill. That's a different era. The big beautiful bill, the big beautiful bill, and how if Trump decided that he wanted to completely ruin Musk, I don't know if he would be wholly successful, but he would definitely threaten it in a way that is just like one more step in the corruption economy that we're seeing, corruption political economy that we're seeing in Washington right now, where would Musk have gotten all those contracts in the absence of some untoward influence in a particular Trump? Probably not, or not all of them.
I will just say, like, disagreeing slightly, like, yes, Washington and Silicon Valley / the tech sectors are intertwined. There is a lot of money that is not in Washington, and more so than the government controls really has ever been, including in some of the people who could bear consequences. And I think about this a little bit the way I think about like Harvard's sort of fight with Trump, which is you've got a well-capitalized individual who could basically say, yeah, look, you've only got 3.5 more years. If I need to float my companies with my personal wealth, can he do that? Can he get other investors to do? There's just a different way to solve this for someone like Elon Musk than for even your average hundreds of millionaire. And that creates a different dynamic too, and a version that could allow for decoupling that wouldn't be available in other settings.
I think that's true, except for how Musk has sort of created this profile of himself as a political influencer. Doesn't even seem like that significantly under minimizes what he, or undersells what he actually is doing. Like is his reputation is off of not just I built these amazing companies, but I did so in this insane, ridiculous way. And here I am at the White House, and here I am doing all this stuff too. So I think that while he might be able to save and even flourish his companies in the space that we're talking about, where Trump has tried to like screw him over in some ways, it's not the same kind of dynamic. It'd be interesting to see, does Musk then try to create a separate power center in some way? And what does it even look like?
Well, and I think that's the thing that autocrats really dislike, whether that's amongst their oligarchs, amongst their universities, amongst other forms of institutions. And that's where I think it'll be interesting to see, and also terrifying to see, exactly how that plays out. One of the things I think you see here when we talk about Trump and Musk specifically, we're talking about individuals with undue, unheard of individual sources of power. And so we're not talking about institutions, even though each of them are ostensibly bounded by some set of institutions, whether that's contract law or the Congress or the Constitution. But instead, we actually have individuals who are unencumbered by those sorts of things, either because of their extraordinary wealth or because of the ways that they're being empowered in the presidency. One thing that I think of in terms of a much more narrower piece, and we can kind of wrap up this segment, SpaceX, Musk's company, has a lot of contracts that predate the Trump administration, partially because it provides very valuable services to NASA and the Department of Defense, and does so in a shockingly more cost-effective way than anybody else can. And that is an unfortunate reality. In some ways, it's a net gain in terms of space launch and sort of commoditizing those prices. The real question that I have in a budget and contract and award sort of thing is kind of what happens to Golden Dome as this relationship falls apart. It doesn't exist in the formal, well, we haven't seen the DoD budget yet, despite the fact that it's June, but it does exist. It has $25 billion allocated potentially in the big, beautiful bill, but is, certainly a sort of thing where there was, Loren, to your point, that overlapping of Trump and Musk individual interests. Trump sort of wanted a very high profile missile defense type system for whatever set of reasons. And Musk's SpaceX in particular seemed well positioned to provide part of the solution for that. And I think now it'll sort of very revealing to see whether in fact that was always meant to be just a huge bag of cash to SpaceX, or whether there was some underlying, or requirement for it. So
Erin,
lots more. Oh, go ahead.
I have one question for you on this that I know you have like 70 hours of thoughts on. And that is like the kind of really basic question that pops up and over again. Like, all right, so what does this tell us about the appropriateness of private space launch being relied on by NASA and other countries? And like, is that even remotely fair to make a judgment based on this kind of ridiculous situation, or is something like this inevitable when you have that sort of private entity that we rely on heavily for things that are of national interest?
Yeah, I think I don't know that it's inevitable that you get to this point. And I guess I would say it is inevitable when you have personalist interests dictating contract awards or contract performance, right? That's why you're supposed to have institutions, both formal, like in a building like Congress or whatnot, but also informal or less, rule of law and these sorts of expectations that help mediate individual disagreements. But both the Department of Defense and NASA have relied on the private sector for provisions both of services, but also of equipment and technology, really back to the beginning. There's certainly been more of an outsourcing around it and a little bit of a shift, especially on the NASA side, to procure services and not procure the underlying technologies. So, NASA doesn't own the Dragon space capsule that SpaceX makes. It procures a service of transport to and from the International Space Center. But, there's the reason why we talk about the relationships, whether they are symbiotic, corrupt, overly intertwined, unhealthy, competitive, and innovative. All of those have been used to describe, the companies that participate in the broader kind of aerospace economy. And, I think, you're not going to get away from the government relying on provision of technology by private companies. That's a move that we've had for really the entire post-Cold War period. The question is, what's the incentive of any of those companies to try to withhold that technology, sell that technology to other companies or on a commercial availability, commercial market? Otherwise, potentially position themselves to be punished. And that's where, like as an acquisition nerd, there were issues with this in the first Trump administration, whether it was on Air Force One, some other projects, but also, you're sort of looking now. It's why you don't want the president involved in individual acquisition decisions. It's why they're meant to be, kind of excessively formalized and sometimes take too long, because you're actually trying to insulate away from exactly this sort of whipsawing and risk. So we'll see kind of, I don't think the president's going to get what he wants out of this per se, with regard to Musk contracts and whatnot. But somebody's going to have to, raise their hand and really, force the courts to enforce actual contract law and, some of these things, as opposed to people being too scared to challenge the administration on these questions.
Yeah, I think your point on rule of law and rule of process being like the undergirding that all of this relies on, that we are now looking at like, I don't really know what's happening here. It is so critical, and not just all the dynamics watching on Twitter, but is the area to watch.
Sticking to this topic of Mr. Musk, but zooming out or zooming differently, I don't know, there's some sort of telescope that we're moving around the sky here, perhaps. One of the things, obviously, that's been dominant topic of conversation, not just the Musk-Trump personal relationship, but really the DOGE of it all, the Department of Government Efficiency, and the cuts, both budget and personnel, and other reforms that have taken place really just in the last 4 months. And I'll be honest, it's hard to imagine it's only been 4 months. Loren, this very much aligns with a lot of the work that you did in your previous job. So can you kind of help remind us of what's happened in the first few months of this second Trump administration with regard to the federal workforce? And like, what are the things that have really caught your eye or raised your eyebrows the most?
Yeah. So I would break it into probably 4 categories with a plus 0.5 that I'll mention as well. So one is just like overall reducing the capacity of the federal workforce in a whole lot of different ways, whether that be around cutting probationary employees, reductions in force that we are seeing right now, and other things that are just like getting people out the door. The fork in the road email saying like, hey, do you want to retire, resign, go on admin leave for a while, we'll get you out. Some of that is getting people out. The other part is for those who are in, making them feel, for a range of reasons, as though they are greater subject to political oversight or may lose their jobs, so that they should not just do their jobs in whatever way that they thought was effective, but that they should be at least pay lip service to loyalty to the president and the president's agenda. And with that comes 2 other things that are like how a big part of how the federal government exercises power and influence is, while also getting rid of capacity, and it's hard. I'll come back to the why it's hard to measure in a second. In addition to getting rid of capacity, halting or doing reviews of contracts across every federal agency based on a set of political views, and also just a set of nonsense that comes with that. And the same thing with grants. And then with that, so like the money out the door. So the federal government saying we're pausing or slowing or halting money out the door to companies, to states, to localities, to otherwise, because that's how we get stuff done. And then the other piece of that is closing offices around the country that are the ways that people access federal power. So it's not just getting rid of people, but it's saying we're no longer going to have an office in a certain county for farmers to access for loans, or no longer going to have a social security office for people to show up and say, hey, what's up with my benefits? All of these are policy by some other means, policy by dollars, policy by accessibility, policy by capacity, or policy by politics. That's a really terrible way to say that, but policy by politics, like they are trying to scare people, policy by fear, scare people into managing all of these things. And what's incredible with all of this is like, these are all things that Congress should be able to scream about. Like, no, that's kind of our job. All of these things are our job, or at least to be able to like give the blessing of in the short term. But coming back to the data piece, it's a huge mess right now because there's so much that is tied up in litigation around, can we actually fire these people? Can we actually shut off these contracts? Can we actually shut off these grants? Can we actually close these offices? So it's not only we're halting all of these things, it's also that we are creating chaos at the same time by making people be questioned whether or not they are coming or going. So the chaos that comes from that, morale challenges that come from that, and overall just like the lack of service that comes from that for the American people are significant, and they're not going to go away for a long time.
So there's 1,000, I think, follow-up questions that we could ask, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to do follow-up segments and other things on this topic. But this has obviously been very disruptive in the near term, just as you described, for both individual federal employees, their families, and then, of course, for those agencies. Can you maybe just riff for a minute on like what the longer term implications might be? Whether that's from firing probationary employees to terminating certain grants. What does this look like 10 to 15 years from now?
Yeah. So I think one quick thing I'll say at the top of that is that thinking about Project 2025 and DOGE together, it's that together, that's them working on this together that made this so effective. Project 2025 had a goal of doing a lot of the same actions, but through existing procedure. DOGE just came in and said, well, what if we just took a chainsaw to everything? And the combination of both of those is creating that chaos that I mentioned of, I don't actually genuinely know, do I have a job tomorrow or not? Will I be rehired in the future or not? That is contributing to not only the short-term consequences, but to the long-term consequences of, would people ever want to work for the federal workforce again? And why? Would people have faith that if they sign a contract with the federal government, that it is going to be a reliable and full faith contract and will be executed in some way? Or should they kind of build into that it won't be? Or would people go through the work of applying for a federal grant, knowing, which is a huge amount of work, knowing that it may be taken out from under them? So not only is it creating implications now in the short term of all things that are going to be cut off, all the things that might have been by talent coming in, by people being executing services, by people doing amazing research, any number of things. The people will be asking the question, like, is this even worth my time, or should I not even bother with this in the future? Which is going to create a huge disruption to what is it we think that public goods are in the United States going forward. I think we'll have a chance to heal that at some point, but it's going to have to be a really, really open healing process.
And you started to get at this, but this seems to have been shockingly, I will call it effective. It's shockingly able to achieve the ends that they set out to do. So why? And what can we learn from that as we're kind of thinking in a go forward sense?
Yeah, totally. So I think they were not shy. Project 2025 got together in 2022, 2023 and issued a plan in 2023 saying, here's our 900-page plan, which is not everything, of what we want to be able to do to federal capacity. Which to me, having a vision that has that implementing, it has the details of it, that was one big addition they had. The second big addition they had was less public. They trained a lot of leaders around their vision of like, you're going to go in, theoretically, you're going to take power. Here's what we want you to be able to take on. So they had the people who showed up on day one, not just like in a transition sense, but in a long-term political vision sense, knowing here's the ethos we're bringing to it. But the piece that really made a difference and would not have been nearly as successful without it is the DOGE arm of implementation. And that was by putting people at a lot of different agencies who showed up and said, I have the power to dig into your data. I have the power to fire people. or I guess it depends on what they're saying in court. I have the power to review all kinds of logs that most people's instinct, the federal government, to say like, I don't think you do, but I don't really know. Okay, fine. Yes. So having those implementers who showed up in their front doors to immediately start executing work is really counter to how a lot of the federal government works overall. And in some cases, kind of satisfying. Like that's actually like a really effective lesson. And when I read the DOGE executive order early on, is saying, we're going to put people who are data experts, IT experts, and procurement experts to support incoming secretaries. I thought, they're probably going to do it to mess things up, but that's a brilliant idea and should absolutely be done and copied elsewhere. So they were effective because the combination of those pieces, now the ends to which that they were doing them and the long-term implications of them breaking lots of laws and process and norms is going to be bad. But how they executed it is 100% things that others should follow.
Do you think, Loren, that they would have been successful, not to make this all about Musk, but like how much of this was that people thought that they were the kind of implementation arm of a guy who's a billionaire and who B, has the ear of the president? And like, do we think that there's now blowback even from this current fallout on DOGE implementation beyond what we've seen already?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I didn't mention as much that made them very effective was the immediate or ongoing access to administrative and other kinds of data that DOGE forced at so many agencies. that allow them to have a better understanding of what's actually going on behind the scenes in the federal government than many political leaders who show up will ever get for a variety of reasons. And did they misinterpret a lot of that data or misuse it or share it in wrong ways? 100%. And that is actually what I'm curious about. Will that go on? Like, there's clearly a desire to have better connectivity between agencies and a lot of the data being shared, such that your immigration status is connected to your IRS filing, is connected to your Medicaid application, and many other things. If Musk fully goes away and all of his power goes away, and as people start getting pulled back, I could see that slowing down, which gives the Trump administration a very different sort of power apparatus than they've had before. Now, on the interesting side of that, while I think a lot of the privacy norms and laws that they are breaking in doing so are bad, and we should not actually have a lot of those things interacting, one of the things that would make the government more effective is having better data connectivity and transparency across agencies, so that when, as opposed to filing your taxes every year, your taxes are just sent to you on a postcard like happens in Norway. Or instead of having to apply for Medicaid through lots of different hoops, Medicaid knows that you are eligible and it's just done. So those things are a possible future that we should continue to think of as a good thing, while still understanding that how Musk and others have tried to implement their work is risky for American values.
I really resonate with that point. I think data connectivity is actually, there's like baby and bathwater here, and like actually data connectivity produces a tremendous amount of government capacity, to go back to your point.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be married with data governance, which they just haven't done. Like, there are no rules and standards, but that does feel like, in trying to think where could we go in a positive sense in the future, thinking about what the rule sets and enforcement mechanisms that could make us comfortable with that connection, so we can realize that state feels like a productive avenue for future thinking.
Fortunately, I have like 10 hours more things to say on this, so hopefully we can record a future episode where we talk all about data governance, which is the sexiest, hottest topic. It would be so much fun.
I would love to be in a world where we were making it easier for people to get Medicaid and possibly federal grants and other things, as opposed to cutting all of those. So that would indeed be a wonderful alternate space to be in. Okay. Final segments, which we have alternately called The Gong Show, The Buzz, Pop Culture. What are some things, Loren, what are some things that you're looking forward to?
The next book in the Rook series is coming out this summer.
No.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't realize.
Okay, so if you guys aren't familiar with the Rook series, all of you would love this. I will just say this universally without knowing you. So the Rook is basically like, imagine crazy sort of like magical superpowers, weirdo bureaucracy in the UK. And the main character is just like an insanely effective bureaucrat, while also being somebody that kicks ass. She learns how to kick ass gradually. An insanely effective bureaucrat who also has a fabulous wardrobe. There are 2 books that happen after that. The 3rd book is partially set in World War II and also has a main character is Sarah from The Little Princess. So all of the above I love. Anyway, the 4th one is coming out. I can't remember the name, but the 4th one is coming out where a person who is involved in the Shakei, which is the magical bureaucracy, is assigned to guard the heir to the British throne. So anyway, it's going to be incredible. I'm so jazzed. It's going to be wonderful. I'm really excited about this.
That is exciting.
Yeah. What about you, Erin?
As you guys probably know, I have bought a record player and it finally works. And now it's my whole personality. So I am looking forward to buying assorted records and just sitting on the floor and listening to them. I currently have OK Computer. And it, like, OK Computer on vinyl is like, you just fill in your pitchfork rant here. It is really something special. And a different thing that you guys should look forward to, if you haven't watched already, there's a new Matthew Good series on Netflix called Department Q. It is maybe the first thing I've ever seen Matthew Good be in that isn't a period piece, because I feel like he's always playing somebody from whatever.
He was in Discovery of Witches, which was also a period piece. But
one season of which is set in the 16th century. But he plays an investigator with a cold case. It's set in Scotland. Everyone else has fantastic Scottish accents. and he is like very scruffy looking.
Oh,
And I'm just saying, Loren, it's really going to be your jam. It might be a little scary, a little twisty for Radha, but like it is quite good.
Erin, I'm imagining you with your record player, like the beginning scene and Almost Famous, where the girl says to her mom, like, you just need to listen to this record and you'll understand me. And then she plays America.
We can query what record my mother needs to listen to understand me, and have that as a separate intro question in the future. Radha, what are you looking forward to?
Well, like Loren, a book in a series I am waiting for is coming out, but it is much more Radha branded. It is the Mr. Darcy and Miss Tilney series. So it's basically imagining a world where the daughter from the couple in the Jane Austen novel Emma and a son from the couple in Pride and Prejudice get together periodically over the summers, and they have a budding romance, but they also solve mysteries. So it's just everything in one piece with references to a variety of characters in the full panoply of Austen and a handful of other author novels. And you can look for them in little Easter eggs. And that is coming out June 17th. So I'm like so close. So it's coming.
That really is Radha core. I mean, I cannot think of anything closer to the core for Radha there. Well, good. Well, that, I think, wraps up the first episode of Sirens, a Bombshell production. We would like to remind folks, if you liked this, to like and subscribe in your podcast app of choice. If we are not providing episodes into the thing in which you listen to podcasts, please find a way to let us know. And you should definitely consider leaving reviews that are interesting. You should also consider telling your friends about this podcast. And we may find a way to read some of those reviews, read some of those new listener reviews in future episodes, so you can have your 5 seconds of fame on the podcasting internet. Ladies, any closing words as we wrap this up?
I hope we have lured some men to their deaths, but they really liked it.
Indeed. Radha.
Squad goals.
All right. With that, we'll see you in a few weeks. Bye.